Hello everyone and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to offer some tips, tricks and general advice for creating a historical Dungeons & Dragons game. If you're new to my channel, you may not know that I'm writing a D&D game based on the time of Anne Boleyn's imprisonment in the Tower of London. So I'm briefly going to touch upon how I came up with the idea and why I chose that time period in general. To be honest, it's quite straightforward. I've read a lot of books on Anne Boleyn and the Tudors in general, so I was already drawing upon some knowledge I already had. I didn't have to start researching from scratch, so I could pretty much come up with the fun elements right away. What I'm getting at here is choose a time period you genuinely find interesting, no matter what it is. Don't choose something because you think it will be popular. Of course that can help, but it's not the be-all and end-all. What takes precedence over everything else is just your attitude to getting a game written and putting in the time to familiarise yourself with that era. Now, if you're in the fortunate position I was in and have read a lot already, that's great. You can start the game writing right away. If you're not and you need to do some reading, that's also fine. You're just starting the game a little earlier than someone who has already done the reading or watching. History channels on YouTube are a great source of information too, as well as podcasts. If, however, you realise the era you're interested in, isn't as interesting as you thought it was, don't panic. You can choose something else. The process of writing a game is supposed to be enjoyable and a nice way to pass the time. Admittedly, some parts will not be as easy and energising as others, but it should be entertaining overall. Right, so how did I actually begin writing my game? How did I take that Tudor lore and actually start structuring it into a game? Well, because I wanted to fit my game onto a one-page scene, I knew that I was dealing with a limited number of scenes, or rooms. So let's say my zine gives me 8 panels to work with. I knew my game had to include 8 scenes, 1 per panel. Each scene is some form of development or an event that moves the game forward. The easiest way to think about this is that each scene represents a different room. However, if your game takes place in only one room, you could make each scene goal orientated, as the players move around that room. For example, in scene 1, do your players have to find something? Then in scene 2, do they need to learn something from an NPC? And so on. Each achievement within a scene takes them a step forward in the game. Also, as I was using a zine with a limited amount of space, I knew I had to get from A to B, or start to finish, in around 8 steps. After that, I began to work backwards to create a story or narrative arc. I haven't finished writing my game yet, but to give you a flavour of how I approach the first 3 scenes in terms of writing and research, I'll quickly run through them. So scene 1 was my exposition, and it's called An Offer They Can't Refuse. The players meet a mysterious figure in the city of York, Holborn. This scene can act as a halfway point between session 0 and session 1, where the players begin to interact with one another and ease into the roleplay. For this scene, I was interested in Tudor taverns and researched the pub my players would meet in. I made this as historically accurate as possible. I'll also link to the video below, where I talk about how I wrote this scene if you want to learn about this in more detail. In scene 2, beyond Traitor's Gate, they make their way to the Tower of London to rescue Anne Boleyn. In this part of the game, I focused my research on the Tower of London layout and how it was guarded. I also included some lore on the Ravens. The Ravens actually feature as mini-beast encounters as well. So yeah, in addition to the tower layout, I also used the research to create historically accurate tiny beasts, which the players have to defeat. The player's aim in this scene is to gain entry into the Tower of London. So, on to scene 3. A Step into Hell. This scene begins when the players have gained access to the Tower of London and are in a mysterious hallway. Unlike the previous scene, this one is more about role-playing and problem-solving. Here, they encounter an old guard called Jonesy. If they are nice to him, he gives them a crucial item that would help them as they progress throughout the game. Because this scene is more about role-playing and Jonesy's connection with the Boleyns, the research here is centred around the Boleyns' personal history and Anne's childhood. I've got videos on how I created all of these scenes, which I will link to in the description. As you can see, I only started to get really specific with my lore when I already had the story in place. Of course, there has to be a little bit of research before this to get an overall idea of the time period, but if you have a slight interest already, you'll likely know enough. So I'd recommend just getting on with the writing. There is always a fine line between research adding to the writing and bogging it down. Get your story sorted first, then research later. Next, I'm going to talk about how I developed my main protagonist and villain. So in my game, the main protagonist is obviously Anne Boleyn, and the villain is Thomas Cromwell. I've created stat blocks for them as there will be crucial NPCs in the game. With Anne Boleyn, I knew she was very religious, highly educated, and a staunch reformist. So when I was looking into character classes, I thought a cleric would suit her, as I felt those class features matched the best with her life experience. Also, because she was a valuable prisoner, she would have been given extra protection compared with others. She was a queen after all, and had to be treated with a high level of respect. So keeping that in mind, I gave her a chain shirt to boost her AC. I also made her proficient in history and religion checks, as of course she was very religious and knew a lot about how the world worked in terms of its politics and international affairs, let's say. Generally, when creating a character based on an actual person, I'd recommend reading as much about them as you can. You'll never know what you'll find out, and some obscure little detail about their life could form a central part of their personality. For example, when I was creating my villain Thomas Cromwell, I stumbled across some interesting information about him, such as the fact he liked to keep exotic pets. Based on this, I weaved into the game the idea of keeping hellhounds throughout the tower, which were Cromwell's personal guard dogs. In terms of NPC build, I chose an illusionist wizard. Cromwell was a very shrewd statesman and a lawyer, so he was very academic and obviously studied a lot to get to that level in court. This aligns well with wizards, who study magic and have to actively learn it, unlike sorcerers who are natural magic users. Cromwell was also a tricky character, especially in how he orchestrated Anne Boleyn's downfall, so this is another reason he suits being an illusionist wizard. I also like the idea of introducing illusions and tricks within the tower to throw my players off. I haven't introduced anything like that yet, but I'm tempted to turn a turret into a wizard's tower of sorts. If I had to compare Cromwell's build to Anne's, I'd say I've been a bit unfair to Cromwell, in the sense I've made him a supervillain. If he hadn't done what the king wanted, he too would have likely been imprisoned and faced the executioner's block, like a lot of Henry's advisors before him. There is a bit of foreshadowing here, however, as Cromwell did indeed eventually face the executioner's block. It all started to go a bit downhill for Cromwell after the poor love match, if that's the right term for it, he set up between Anne of Cleves and Henry VIII. So that brings me to the end of my quick overview of how I approach research when writing scenes and creating characters. I do have one final piece of advice though, and that is to not overwhelm your game with too much historical lore. What I mean by this is that the lore should be woven into the fabric of the game, and the GM should not have to go through reams of text on who Anne Boleyn and Thomas Cromwell are. Their stories, like those of any other character, should offer useful information on their traits, motivations and flaws, as ultimately this is what guides the actions a GM takes. After so much reading, it is tempted to include everything, but I strongly advise against doing this. Your game should be a careful curation of historical fact and fiction. Now this isn't easy, and when you've been working so closely on something for such a long time, you may lose sight of the direction of where you want to take your game. This is another reason why I like limiting myself to several scenes at a time, as it forces me to be concise. Anyway, I'd really like to hear about your approach to designing your games and how you split your time between writing and research. Right, that's all for today, folks, and I'll see you in the next one.